4 came back, but not all of them were the ones who left.
We haven't just changed, it has rewritten us.
Are you afraid? But this is just the beginning. We will become one.
It's still here.
The world waited with bated breath as the Phoenix Endeavour returned home. The spacecraft had been declared lost 3 years earlier, its crew presumed dead after all communication ceased just days after they touched down on Proxima B. But now, against all odds, the capsule glided through the atmosphere, its heat shields flaring in brilliant streaks across the morning sky. The world held its collective breath. When the capsule landed in the Arizona desert, government and military personnel moved in swiftly to contain the area, though news helicopters circled above, capturing grainy images that would become the most replayed footage of the century. The ship's hatch opened, and 4 figures emerged, each one moving with an unearthly grace that the cameras couldn't quite capture. They appeared untouched by the passage of time, their faces smooth, their bodies radiating vitality. Captain Elena Ross was the first to step forward, her dark hair shining like polished obsidian under the harsh sunlight. Behind her came Dr. Marcus Halstead, the ship's biologist, tall and wiry with sharp eyes that darted across the assembled crowd as though cataloging everything in sight. Engineer Liam Okoro and navigator Rebecca Kane followed, their movements synchronized in a way that struck onlookers as both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The silence stretched on as the astronauts stood there, surveying the sea of awestruck faces before them. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice steady and commanding. "We have returned," she said simply, but there was something in her tone, something that made even the most hardened military officers shift uncomfortably. In the days that followed, the world's awe turned into a kind of reverence. The Phoenix crew's return was hailed as nothing short of a miracle. News anchors called them heroes. Scientists marveled at their newfound brilliance. Yet the initial celebrations gave way to unease as the world began to notice what was off. The astronauts were not the same people who had left Earth. Their bodies, for one, seemed impossibly enhanced. Marcus Halstead demonstrated reflexes so fast that a falling glass never made it halfway to the floor before his hand snapped out to catch it. Rebecca Kane's eyesight had become so precise she could read the fine print of legal documents from across a room. Liam Okoro startled medics during a routine post-mission checkup when his pulse climbed to an astonishing 200 beats per minute after minimal exertion, yet he showed no signs of fatigue. The crew insisted these changes were natural consequences of their prolonged exposure to Proxima B's unique environment, though none of them could recall specifics about the planet's conditions. When questioned about their time on Proxima B, their answers were maddeningly vague. Marcus spoke of a pulse, a sensation of energy that had passed through their bodies shortly after landing. Rebecca described the planet's surface as both alien and familiar, an endless expanse of blackened rock beneath a crimson sky. Liam recalled structures, tall, spindly towers that seemed to hum with a life of their own, but couldn't describe their purpose or how they'd interacted with them. Elena, for her part, avoided speaking about Proxima B altogether, her lips pressing into a thin line whenever the subject came up. The debriefings were equally fruitless. The Phoenix's onboard data logs were corrupted, their hard drives wiped clean by what appeared to be a massive electromagnetic burst. The surviving crew members offered no explanation for the deaths of their 3 missing colleagues. "We don't remember," Elena said, her tone cold, unyielding. "Something happened, but it's gone now. Like a dream you wake up from and can't piece together." Still, their brilliance was undeniable. Within weeks of their return, Marcus Halstead presented groundbreaking papers on xenobiology, detailing theoretical adaptations for life on other planets that defied current scientific understanding. Rebecca Kane sketched out blueprints for an advanced navigation system that seemed almost too advanced, as though it hadn't been designed by human hands. Liam Okoro took apart one of the Phoenix's damaged engines and reassembled it in a way that made it twice as efficient. When asked how they'd come by this knowledge, their answers were always the same. "It just came to us." But there were cracks beneath the surface, glimpses of something darker. Liam was the first to show signs of strain. He began to isolate himself, claiming he could feel something crawling beneath his skin. During a routine medical exam, a technician swore she saw Liam's muscles shifting unnaturally under his skin, as though something were slithering through his veins. Rebecca started speaking in her sleep, muttering strings of gibberish that linguists later identified as a proto-language with no known origin. Marcus became obsessed with his own blood, taking sample after sample and spending long nights hunched over a microscope in the lab. And Elena began to draw. It started with small sketches in the margins of her reports, abstract shapes that spiraled into one another like fractals, but soon her quarters were filled with them. She drew on walls, on tables, even on the backs of her hands. The drawings were intricate, almost architectural, resembling the spindly towers Liam had described. When asked about them, Elena shrugged. "They're nothing," she said, but her voice was tight, her hands shaking slightly. The world's fascination with the Phoenix crew turned to suspicion after an incident during a televised interview. A journalist asked Liam about the missing crew members, and for a moment he froze. His face twitched, his pupils dilated, and when he spoke, his voice was low and strange, layered as though 2 voices were speaking at once. "They weren't strong enough to carry the gift," he said, before collapsing on the studio floor. In the chaos that followed, Elena stood over Liam's convulsing body, her face impassive. "It's starting," she whispered, too softly for anyone but Rebecca to hear. The memory gaps were the first thing every specialist flagged during the astronauts' debriefings. Despite their apparent lucidity, their accounts of Proxima B remained fractured, incomplete. The fragments they shared were disjointed: the strange pulse, the alien structures, the sensation of being watched. None of it fit together, and when pressed for details, each of them reacted differently. Marcus Halstead grew defensive, his voice tight and his answers clipped. Rebecca Kane shut down entirely, staring off into the distance with hollow eyes. Liam Okoro lashed out, accusing his questioners of treating them like lab specimens. And Elena Ross? She simply folded her arms, her silence colder than any protest. At first, their fragmented memories were dismissed as the result of trauma. After all, the astronauts had survived a mission no one expected them to return from. But as time went on, the fragments began to surface in more vivid, unsettling detail. They came to the astronauts in dreams, in flashes of recollection triggered by ordinary sights and sounds. Rebecca was the first to experience this. She woke in the middle of the night to find herself sitting cross-legged on her bed, her hands covered in chalky white dust she couldn't explain. Her chest heaved with the remnants of a panic she didn't remember feeling, and when she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, she didn't recognize her own eyes. They seemed darker, deeper, like something was peering out from behind them. Later that morning, during a group session with a psychologist, Rebecca broke her silence. Her voice trembled as she spoke of a vast, open plain beneath a blood-red sky. She described the structures that dotted the landscape, towering spires that seemed to grow directly from the ground, their surfaces pulsating faintly, almost like breathing. They weren't buildings, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were alive. I could feel them watching us. Marcus leaned forward at this, his eyes narrowing. You felt it too, he asked, his tone urgent. He had dreamed of the same spires the night before, though he hadn't mentioned it to anyone. He described walking among them, their surfaces warm to the touch, the air around them humming with a low, resonant frequency that seemed to penetrate his very bones. But beyond that, his memory went blank. For Elena, the memories came in jagged pieces, like shards of a shattered mirror. One moment she was standing on the Phoenix, looking out at Proxima B's desolate surface. The next, she was inside one of the structures, its walls smooth and glistening like polished obsidian. She remembered touching the wall and feeling it ripple beneath her palm, as though the structure itself was alive. Then came the pulse, a sudden blinding flash of energy that knocked her off her feet and filled her head with a sound she could only describe as the roar of 1,000 voices. When she awoke, she was back on the Phoenix, her crew surrounding her, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. Liam's recollections were the most disturbing. He remembered digging. His hands were raw and bloody, his fingernails broken as he clawed through the dirt in a frantic search for something. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he remembered the overwhelming compulsion, the sense that his very survival depended on finding it. He described the taste of the dirt, metallic, bitter, laced with something that made his tongue go numb. But when he tried to explain what happened next, his voice faltered. There was something in the ground, he said finally, his voice trembling. Something alive. It moved. As the memories surfaced, the astronauts' bodies began to betray them. Marcus became consumed with his research, locking himself in his lab for days at a time. He worked obsessively, running test after test on his own blood and tissue samples. What he found made his stomach churn. His cells were no longer entirely human. The alien proteins embedded within them were growing, replicating, integrating themselves into his very DNA. He tried to tell himself it was a mutation, a side effect of exposure to Proxima B's environment. But deep down, he knew better. Rebecca's whispers grew worse. She would wake in the middle of the night, her lips moving soundlessly as her fingers traced patterns on the walls of her quarters. Linguists who analyzed her recordings identified the whispers as a language, though it matched no known linguistic structure. Rebecca claimed she could hear voices speaking to her, guiding her. "They're trying to help us," she insisted during one session, though her tone carried an edge of doubt. "They want us to understand." Liam's condition deteriorated rapidly. He complained of a burning sensation beneath his skin, a constant itch he couldn't scratch. He began to eat voraciously, consuming raw meat with a desperation that horrified those around him. His muscles twitched and rippled unnaturally, and his skin took on a faint, sickly sheen. During a routine examination, a doctor noticed something moving beneath the surface of Liam's arm, something that slithered away when pressed. Elena, meanwhile, withdrew completely. She spent hours staring at the diagrams she had drawn, her expression unreadable. She refused to explain their significance, claiming she didn't even remember drawing them. But one night, Marcus found her in the lab, standing over a holographic projection of Proxima B's surface. She was tracing the outlines of the spires with her finger, her lips moving silently. When Marcus asked her what she was doing, she turned to him with an eerie calm and said, "It's not just a planet, it's a body, and we're inside it now." The pieces of their memories began to form a pattern, but it was one they could scarcely comprehend. The pulse had been no random event. It had been deliberate, a means of embedding something within them. The spires weren't buildings, but appendages, extensions of a living, sentient entity that spanned the entire planet. It had studied them, altered them, and now it was using them. The transformations could no longer be ignored. The government had quietly quarantined the surviving astronauts in a remote facility, but the effects of their return were beginning to ripple outward. Plants within the surrounding area were mutating, leaves growing thicker, stems twisting unnaturally toward the air like coiled springs. Animals near the facility became increasingly aggressive, their movements erratic, as though something in the environment was disrupting their instincts. The changes mirrored what was happening within the crew themselves. Liam Okoro was the first to fully succumb. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, his body no longer able to contain the thing growing inside him. He spent most days trembling in his bed, his voice hoarse from muttering incomprehensible words. The medical staff monitored him around the clock, their faces pale as they watched the pulsating shapes beneath his skin become more pronounced. His body seemed to reject its own boundaries, his skin stretching and splitting in grotesque patches. When the end came, it was sudden and violent. The facility's alarm blared late one night as Liam's screams filled the air. By the time Elena, Marcus, and Rebecca arrived, the medical wing was in chaos. The nurses were gone, fled, or dead. Blood slicked the walls, but there were no bodies, only long trails of viscous, glistening fluid leading toward the far corner of the room. In the center of it all was Liam, or what remained of him. His body had ruptured completely, his chest cavity peeled open like the petals of a grotesque flower. What emerged from within was beyond comprehension. Tendrils of flesh tipped with translucent sacs, each one throbbing with an otherworldly glow. Rebecca fell to her knees, retching, but Elena stepped forward, her jaw tight. "This is it," she whispered, staring at the writhing mass. "This is what we brought back." Marcus approached cautiously, his scientist's mind warring with his instinct to run. He reached out with a trembling hand to touch one of the sacs, and as his fingers brushed its surface, He felt a surge of alien memories flood his mind. Images of Proxima B flashed before him, the spires rising like sentinels, the pulse surging through the air, and the realization that the planet itself was alive, its consciousness embedded in every molecule. The structures had not merely been appendages, they were its thoughts made physical. He staggered back, clutching his head. "It's not a parasite," he gasped, his voice shaking. "It's a seed, and we're the soil." The revelation hit them all at once. Proxima B hadn't just altered them, it had used them, hollowing them out to make room for itself. The planet's organism was not bound by the confines of its surface. It existed to spread, to propagate, embedding fragments of itself into anything it could touch. The pulse had been the first step, and now Earth was the next. Rebecca rose unsteadily to her feet, her eyes wild. "It's inside all of us," she said, her voice laced with hysteria. "We've been carrying it this whole time, breathing it, spreading it." The weight of her words settled over them, heavy and suffocating. Marcus, still clutching his head, looked at Elena. "We have to stop it," he said. "We can't let it spread." Elena's expression was grim. "We need to understand what we're dealing with first," she said. "We need to go deeper." But Rebecca was shaking her head. "You don't understand," she said, backing away. "It doesn't want to be stopped. It's already winning. Can't you feel it?" They could feel it. It was in the air, a faint metallic tang that clung to their tongues and made their heads swim. It was in their blood, their bones, their thoughts. The thing from Proxima B was no longer separate from them. It was them. As the days passed, the transformations accelerated. Marcus's obsession with his own biology grew more desperate. He spent hours under the microscope, cataloging every change, every mutation. He discovered that the alien proteins within their bodies were not merely integrating, but rewriting their DNA entirely. They weren't evolving, they were becoming something else. Elena began to hear voices, not whispers like Rebecca's, but a deep, resonant hum that filled her skull. At first, she thought it was just in her mind, but when she spoke aloud to test it, the hum responded. It wasn't just speaking to her, it was listening. Rebecca's descent was the most dramatic. She began isolating herself, spending hours in her quarters where she covered every surface with strange symbols and diagrams. When Elena confronted her, Rebecca's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "It's not wrong," she said softly. "It's just different. We're different, don't you see? This is what we were meant to be." Elena recoiled, horror flashing across her face. "You don't believe that?" she said, her voice trembling. Rebecca smiled faintly, her expression distant. "I do," she said, "and soon you will too." The turning point came when Marcus discovered the spores. He had been running tests on samples taken from the air around the facility, and what he found made his blood run cold. Microscopic organisms, identical to the structures within their own bodies, were spreading through the air at an exponential rate. They were being exhaled, sweat out, shed with every movement the astronauts made. The facility was no longer a containment zone. It was a breeding ground. "It's already started," Marcus said, his voice hollow as he showed Elena the results. "We're the carriers. We're the plague." Elena stared at the data, her jaw tightening. She turned to Rebecca, who stood silently in the corner, her glowing eyes fixed on them with an unsettling calm. "You knew," Elena said, her voice cold. "You knew this was happening." Rebecca tilted her head, her expression serene. "Of course I knew," she said. "It's not something to fear, Elena. It's something to embrace. We're becoming more than human. We're becoming it." The air inside the facility had turned heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something metallic, like the taste of blood on the tongue. Outside, the world waited, oblivious to what was growing, spreading, birthing itself within the quarantined walls. The four who had once been astronauts were no longer human, not entirely. Marcus could see it in the way their eyes glowed faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights, in the unnatural stillness of their bodies when they stood in silence, listening to the whispers only they could hear. And he could feel it inside himself, something coiled and waiting, tightening its grip. Rebecca Kane stood at the center of the room, her skin pale and faintly translucent, her veins glowing softly like threads of molten gold. She no longer tried to hide what she had become. She embraced it, standing taller, more assured, as though her body belonged to something far greater than herself. Behind her, the walls of the facility were covered in pulsating growths, fleshy, fibrous tendrils that wept a viscous, luminous fluid. The spores had taken root. The room was alive. "We were never meant to return," Rebecca said, her voice layered, resonant, carrying an authority that silenced even Elena. "Proxima B didn't send us back to warn the Earth. It sent us back to remake it." Elena Ross stood several feet away, her sidearm shaking in her hand. She had never wanted to believe it, even as the evidence mounted, even as she felt the alien presence twisting inside her like a parasite, merging with her thoughts, her cells. But now, staring at Rebecca, no, not Rebecca anymore, something inside Rebecca, she couldn't deny the truth. "This isn't you," Elena said, her voice cracking. "Whatever this thing is, it's using you. You're still in there, Rebecca. You can fight it." Rebecca smiled faintly, her head tilting to the side in a gesture that was almost childlike. "You don't understand," she said. "There's nothing to fight. I see it now, Elena. I understand what it wants, what we are meant to be. It's beautiful." "It's not beautiful," Marcus snapped, stepping forward. His lab coat was stained with blood and fluid from Liam's remains, his eyes hollowed from sleepless nights of studying the alien spores. "It's a parasite, a cancer. It doesn't care about us, about this planet. It's just feeding, consuming, spreading. And when it's done, it'll leave nothing behind." Rebecca's serene smile faltered for the briefest moment, but her composure returned just as quickly. "You're wrong," she said. "It's not taking from us, it's giving. Don't you feel it, Marcus? The strength, the knowledge. We're evolving, becoming something greater." Elena tightened her grip on the gun, her mind racing. She didn't trust her body anymore. She could feel it betraying her, the alien organism rewriting her from the inside out. Every muscle felt too strong, every sensation too sharp, as though her own senses were turning against her. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on to what was left of herself. "We can't let this spread," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. He glanced at Elena, his expression grim. We have to end it. Now. Elena nodded, her throat tightening. She knew what he meant. The weapon they had developed, an aerosolized compound designed to destroy the alien DNA, was their only chance. But it would also kill them. Their bodies were too far gone, too intertwined with the organism to survive its eradication. Rebecca stepped forward, her movements fluid, almost hypnotic. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You can join us. Become part of something infinite, something eternal." She reached out a hand toward Elena, her eyes glowing brighter. "You've felt it, haven't you? The connection, the power. You don't have to be afraid." Elena's finger hovered over the trigger. For a moment, she hesitated. She could feel it, the alien presence humming in the back of her mind, whispering promises of unity, of freedom from fear and pain and mortality. It would be so easy to let go, to stop fighting, to let it take her. But then she thought of the world outside, the people who had no idea what was coming, who would be consumed just as she was. She thought of Liam's screams, of Marcus's hollow eyes, of what Rebecca had become. "I'm not afraid," Elena said, her voice steady. And then she fired. The bullet tore through Rebecca's chest, but instead of blood, a burst of glowing, golden fluid sprayed from the wound. Rebecca staggered, her expression one of surprise more than pain. She looked down at her chest, then back up at Elena, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It won't matter," she said softly. "You can't stop it." Elena ignored her. She turned to Marcus, who had already moved to the console, his fingers flying across the controls. The compound was ready to deploy, its canisters positioned throughout the facility. All it needed was the final command. "You'll die too," Marcus said, his voice breaking. Elena met his gaze, her jaw set. "I know." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before he nodded. His trembling hand hovered over the button. Behind them, Rebecca collapsed to her knees, the light in her eyes flickering. The tendrils on the walls writhed violently, as though sensing what was about to happen. "Do it," Elena said. Marcus pressed the button. The release was instantaneous. The air filled with a hissing sound as the compound spread, its molecules binding to the alien spores and tearing them apart on a molecular level. The tendrils shriveled and blackened, the pulsating sacs bursting like overripe fruit. Rebecca let out a strangled cry, her body convulsing as the glow beneath her skin dimmed and faded. Elena felt it too, the alien presence inside her screaming, clawing, trying to hold on as the compound worked its way through her body. She fell to her knees, her vision blurring, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Marcus slumped against the console, his skin pale, his eyes glassy. "We did it," he whispered. "We stopped it." Elena managed a faint smile, even as her body began to fail. "Yeah," she said, "we did." The last thing she saw was the glow fading from Rebecca's eyes, leaving only darkness. When the facility was breached days later, the cleanup crew found no survivors. The alien infestation was gone, eradicated completely, but the air still carried a faint, metallic tang. In a small town hundreds of miles away, a child sat in the dirt, drawing spirals and shapes in the dust. The patterns resembled the spires of Proxima B. The child's eyes glowed faintly in the twilight, and as she whispered to herself, the air around her seemed to hum. The gods they feared had not died. They had only begun